Two twin brothers bought an abandoned plot of land for pennies, but when they found an old wooden shed on it and decided to open it, they made a discovery that changed their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. Michael and Thomas had always felt as if the narrow streets of their industrial town were closing in on them. The smell of coal smoke lingered in the air, no matter the season, and the sound of clattering machinery and factory whistles was so constant that silence seemed almost mythical. They were born identical twins, inseparable from childhood, yet those who knew them well always remarked on their differences. Michael was the more measured one, careful with his words and deliberate in his actions, while Thomas carried an untamed spark, always the first to leap forward, sometimes before thinking. Together they balanced each other as though two halves of the same coin, and both carried the same deep longing to escape the place where they had grown up and find land they could call their own. Their father had been a builder, a man with calloused hands and a stern expression who taught them to work with wood and stone from the time they were old enough to lift a hammer. Their mother had taught them something different: patience, humility, and the idea that even the poorest family could hold dignity if it kept its values intact. Yet despite their parents' lessons, both brothers grew restless. The city's narrow alleys, the rickety row houses, and the blackened walls of the factories had shaped their youth. But now in their late 20s, they longed for something beyond. They often spoke about fields, orchards, and wide skies, landscapes that until now had been nothing more than a dream. When the advertisement for a land auction appeared on Michael's computer one winter night, it was Thomas who leaned over his shoulder, his eyes alight with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The listing described a plot on the outskirts of an abandoned farm, just outside a small town nearly forgotten by the main roads. The price was absurdly low, so low it made them suspicious. No one seemed interested in bidding, and that alone suggested the place might be cursed with bad soil, ruined buildings, or legal entanglements. Yet the brothers looked at one another, and without words they both knew what the other was thinking. This could be the chance they had been waiting for. They hesitated at first, debating whether they should risk their limited savings. Michael argued for caution, but Thomas pushed forward, saying opportunities like this never came twice. The bidding process itself felt surreal. They watched as the clock ticked down and realized no one else was going to make an offer. With a few quick clicks, they placed their bid, half expecting someone to outbid them in the final seconds. But the screen flashed with confirmation, and the lot was theirs. For a few moments, they sat in stunned silence, the reality slowly sinking in. They were landowners now. The industrial town that had bound them for so long no longer held their entire future. Excitement bubbled up between them in the following days as they made plans. They imagined planting orchards, building a house with wide porches, even raising animals. Of course, the description of the land had been vague, the pictures grainy and outdated, but none of that mattered. It was theirs. Every dream they had ever whispered late at night suddenly seemed possible. When spring came, and the air finally softened with the scent of new growth, the brothers loaded their pickup truck with tools, provisions, and the few possessions they thought they might need. The drive was long, carrying them farther from the choking smoke of their hometown and into open countryside. The landscape gradually changed, factories giving way to rolling fields, woods, and distant hills. For the first time in years, they rolled down their windows and let the wind carry the scent of grass and earth into the cab of the truck. The road grew narrower as they left the main highway, turning onto a series of gravel lanes that twisted between neglected fields. Wooden fences leaned precariously, half swallowed by weeds, and barns in the distance sagged as if too tired to keep standing. The directions they had printed out led them finally to a long dirt path that curved toward a cluster of trees. At the end of the path lay the land they had bought, stretching out unevenly across a wide clearing. At first sight, disappointment flickered across Michael's face. The land was wild, choked with tall grass and thorny bushes, and the soil looked rough and untended. Old fence posts leaned in strange angles, and in one corner stood the remains of what might once have been a gate, now rotting and nearly invisible beneath vines. The property looked as though no one had cared for it in decades. Yet even in that abandonment, there was something compelling. The silence was deep, broken only by the rustling of wind through the grass, and the sky above was an endless blue unmarred by smoke or soot. Thomas stepped out of the truck and inhaled deeply, stretching his arms as though the land itself belonged to him already. Michael followed more slowly, his cautious eyes scanning the ground, noting where it dipped unevenly or where stones jutted out like old bones. They walked together, their boots crunching against patches of dry earth, exploring the perimeter. The land was larger than they expected, stretching far back into the woods. Every few steps brought a new detail: a rusted piece of farm equipment, a crumbling stone wall, the faint outlines of an old path. Then, almost hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes, they saw it. At first they thought it was simply another pile of decaying wood. But as they pushed the branches aside, the outline of a small building came into view. It was a shed, though it looked more like a ghost of one, its wooden boards blackened with age, its roof sagging inward, where time and storms had taken their toll. The brothers stopped, staring at it. The shed stood alone, crooked but strangely stubborn, as though refusing to collapse entirely. Something about its presence struck them both at once. This was not mentioned in the documents or the auction listing. Its existence was a mystery, and the more they looked at it, the more a strange curiosity gripped them. Michael narrowed his eyes, trying to judge whether the shed was safe to even approach. Thomas, on the other hand, felt a strange thrill. A shed like this might hold nothing but junk, but it might also hold something forgotten. After all, abandoned places sometimes carried secrets the world had overlooked. He glanced at his brother, saw the hesitation in his face, and without waiting, strode forward through the tall grass. The air around the shed was heavy, filled with the scent of mold and damp wood. The walls bore deep cracks, and moss clung stubbornly to the corners. The door hung on rusted hinges, its frame warped. Yet despite its fragile appearance, the structure seemed to radiate a strange permanence, as if it had been waiting for them. Michael joined his brother at last, both of them standing before the shed in silence. They could feel that this was not just another remnant of the land's past. It was something more, something that might connect them to the very reason this property had lain forgotten for so long. Neither spoke, but both sensed it. Their journey had only just begun, and this weathered wooden building was about to change everything they thought they knew about their new home. And with that unspoken understanding, they knew their next step would be to see what secrets the shed concealed, though neither yet realized how deeply those secrets would tie into the history of the land or the destiny awaiting them. The first day on their new property had not only fulfilled their dream of owning land, it had also set them on a path toward an inheritance far greater than anything they had imagined. The shed loomed before them like a forgotten sentinel of another era. Though the rest of the land lay in disrepair, tangled with weeds and suffocated by silence, the structure seemed to hold a strange authority over the clearing. Its roof sagged inward under the weight of years, the edges bowed and broken, as though storms had tried and failed to sweep it away entirely. The boards that formed its walls were warped and blackened with rot, yet they clung together stubbornly, resisting collapse. Sunlight pierced through the canopy of trees above and caught on the jagged lines of the shed, making the cracks in its surface glow faintly, as if drawing attention to its very ruin. Michael and Thomas stood in front of it without speaking, each absorbing the scene in his own way. Michael's brow furrowed in concern, his cautious nature searching for danger, whether the shed might collapse if they entered, whether snakes or other creatures had made it their home. Thomas, however, felt a familiar thrill at the sight of the forgotten building. Where his brother saw decay, he saw possibility. In his imagination, sheds like these had always belonged in stories of discovery, where treasures or secrets waited for those brave enough to open the door. He could not help but feel that fate had placed this place in their path deliberately. The brothers circled the structure, their boots crunching in the thick grass. The shed's back wall leaned against a cluster of overgrown bushes, their branches twisting into its broken boards as if trying to reclaim the wood. Along the ground near the foundation, mushrooms sprouted in damp clusters, feeding on the rot. Each step closer released the scent of mold and wet earth, heavy enough to sting the nose. The door, once painted red perhaps, had faded to a colorless gray, its surface gouged with scars of time. Two rusted hinges groaned as the breeze moved the warped frame ever so slightly, producing a sound that reminded Michael of the screech of metal against stone. Thomas tugged gently at the door, but it resisted. The frame had swollen with years of rain and dampness, sealing it shut. He tried again, harder this time, and the shed trembled in protest, as though warning them to leave it alone. Michael put a hand on his brother's shoulder, urging patience, but Thomas shook him off with a grin. He knelt and began pulling aside piles of debris that had accumulated near the base splintered boards, a nest of brittle straw, and even the skeletal remains of a long-dead animal. Once cleared, the brothers could see that the door was not merely stuck but bound. A rusted chain, thick despite its age, looped through the handle and around an iron clasp. The padlock attached was corroded, its shape almost fused together, yet its purpose was clear. Someone long ago had locked the shed deliberately, ensuring that no curious hands could wander inside. The sight of the lock deepened the mystery. It was not unusual for farm buildings to be secured, but the land had been abandoned for decades, and everything else on the property lay open, exposed to the elements. Why had this shed alone been chained shut so firmly? And what had been so important inside that its keeper wished it never be touched? Michael, ever wary, considered turning back. Perhaps the shed held nothing but old chemicals or dangerous tools, hazards best left untouched. But Thomas's curiosity burned too brightly to be restrained. His eyes scanned the ground until they found a length of metal pipe, half buried in the soil. Rust flaked off as he lifted it, but it was solid enough to serve his purpose. He wedged the pipe into the loop of the lock and began pressing with all his strength. The chain rattled violently, the shed shuddered, and for a moment it seemed the lock might never give way. Then with a shriek of metal surrendering, it snapped open, and the chain fell heavily into the dirt. The brothers exchanged a long look, a silent recognition that what they were doing could not be undone. Then Thomas gripped the handle and pulled. The door resisted for a second before groaning outward, swinging into the light and scattering a cascade of dust and cobwebs into the air. The interior of the shed revealed itself slowly as their eyes adjusted to the gloom. At first it was only shadows, thick and unmoving, pierced by faint beams of sunlight filtering through the roof. Dust motes floated like tiny stars in the air, disturbed by the sudden movement of the door. The smell hit them next, a pungent mix of rotting wood, mildew, and something older, almost metallic, like rusted iron. Michael retrieved a flashlight from his pack, its beams slicing through the darkness in a pale arc. The light revealed chaos within, piles of broken furniture stacked against the walls, their legs snapped, and their frames half buried beneath cobwebs. Old tools lay scattered across the dirt floor, rusted beyond recognition. Shelves bowed under the weight of jars filled with cloudy liquid, their labels long dissolved by time. And yet, despite the clutter, something caught their eyes almost immediately. At the far corner, arranged with a strange sense of order that contrasted with the decay, stood a series of large wooden boxes. They were stacked neatly one atop another, their surfaces cracked and warped, but unmistakably crafted to endure. Some bore rusted metal locks that hung uselessly, their mechanisms frozen with corrosion. One, however, had shifted slightly open, the lid tilted as though inviting them closer. The brothers moved cautiously toward it, the beams of their flashlights trembling against the rough walls. The boxes seemed to radiate importance, as if they had been placed there with intention, not forgotten like the other debris. Dust clung to their edges, but the wood still retained a faint sheen of polish in certain spots, suggesting they had once been valued possessions. Michael crouched beside the box with the open lid, his heart pounding louder than he liked to admit. Slowly, almost reverently, he lifted the lid. The hinges groaned softly, and the contents revealed themselves in the dim light. Inside were bundles of papers tied with brittle string, their edges yellowed with age. Beneath them lay a carefully rolled blueprint, the parchment fragile but intact. Resting atop the stack was a bundle of photographs, their black and white images blurred but still recognizable. The brothers leaned closer, fascinated. The photographs depicted a man standing beside a woman and two small children. The family was posed stiffly in the fashion of early 20th century portraits, their expressions solemn yet proud. Behind them loomed a house of sturdy design, unfamiliar yet striking, as though it might once have stood on this very land. The man, tall and stern, wore a suit that hinted at wealth, while the woman's dress, though modest, spoke of refinement. The children clutched small objects in their hands, though the details were too faded to identify. Michael carefully unrolled the blueprint, the paper crackling under his touch. Lines spread across the surface in precise order, forming the plan for a building. Walls, rooms, staircases, everything was marked with meticulous care. In the corner of the page, however, something unusual drew their attention. A small symbol, sketched clearly, represented an upside-down triangle. Inside the triangle were the letters CR, bold and deliberate, as if the initials belonged to someone of significance. The weight of the discovery pressed on them. The shed was not simply a forgotten structure. It had been guarding something of meaning, something tied to the land's history. The initials raised questions neither could answer. Who was CR? Was the man in the photograph the same person whose mark now appeared on the blueprint? Why had he hidden these things away in this place? Michael and Thomas exchanged puzzled looks, the air between them charged with a new determination. Whatever mystery the land held, it was larger than they had imagined. The shed, with its ruined boards and its heavy chain, had been more than a shelter for tools or storage. It had been a vault protecting a story waiting to be uncovered. As the brothers stepped back into the fading daylight, clutching the fragile blueprint and the photographs, they knew they had crossed into something greater than mere ownership of land. The auction had given them property, yes, but it had also given them an inheritance of questions, secrets, and perhaps destiny. The silence of the clearing seemed heavier now, as though the land itself had acknowledged their intrusion and was daring them to continue deeper. Neither spoke as they closed the shed door behind them. Words felt unnecessary, even inadequate. They had unearthed the first thread of a tapestry that stretched backward into forgotten generations. They could sense that the discovery was only the beginning. In the stillness of the evening, with the sun dipping low and shadows lengthening across the clearing, the shed stood behind them like a guardian, and ahead lay the promise of a search that would demand everything they had to give. The mystery of the land had only deepened, and the answers lay hidden in places they had yet to find. What they had uncovered was not just relics of the past, but an invitation to follow where history would lead them, into secrets buried deeper than either brother could yet imagine. The evening after they first pried open the shed and uncovered the strange assortment of papers, the brothers returned to the small rented room they had taken in town, carrying the box between them as if it were some fragile relic that might disintegrate with the faintest misstep. Their minds whirled with questions as they set the box on the table, each glance they shared filled with equal parts excitement and unease. The photographs had stirred something intangible, a connection to lives that had once walked the very soil they now owned, and the blueprint with its mysterious initials lingered in their thoughts like an echo they could not ignore. But it was the leather-bound diary, tucked beneath the piles of papers and nearly lost in the dust, and that drew them most of all. The book was worn with age, its edges frayed, the leather cracked and brittle. When Michael lifted it carefully and ran his fingers over its surface, it released a smell of dust and ink that seemed to carry the breath of another century. The clasp had long since rusted away, and when he opened it, the pages groaned in protest, brittle and yellow, the ink faded, but still legible beneath the soft glow of the lamp. The brothers leaned close, their shoulders nearly touching, and began to read. The diary belonged to a man named Jonathan Grayson, as he himself signed in elegant but severe script on the first page. Already the name struck them, for though it did not match the initials on the blueprint, it matched something in the tone of the land. Grayson described himself as a farmer and craftsman, a man who had inherited the property from his father at the turn of the century. The early pages spoke of his efforts to tame the fields, to build a barn, and to raise livestock. He wrote of hardships, of seasons where the rains never came, and of winters that froze the soil so hard that nothing grew. Yet alongside those struggles, there were glimpses of pride, a harvest that fed not only his family but neighbors in need, a new plow he had fashioned with his own hands, the laughter of his children echoing across the fields. As the brothers turned the pages, however, the tone of the writing shifted. The steady records of farm life gave way to notes heavy with worry. Jonathan wrote of the changing world beyond his fields. There were whispers of wars brewing overseas, of markets collapsing, of uncertainty in the government. He feared that one day those storms would find their way even to his isolated farm, stripping away all he had built. His writing grew more urgent, more anxious. He confessed to lying awake at night, listening to the wind rattle the boards of the house, imagining soldiers marching down his lane, or neighbors turning desperate and violent in the face of hunger. It was in these pages that the first mention of an underground refuge appeared. Jonathan recorded his intent to build a place where his family could be safe no matter what came. He detailed his thoughts in careful, methodical order, writing as though his words were both instruction and confession. He would dig beneath the land, reinforce the walls with stone, stock the rooms with food, water, and books. He wanted not only to protect their bodies, but to preserve their minds, believing that knowledge was as essential as bread. The more the brothers read, the more they felt the diary pulling them into Jonathan's world. He described long nights drawing sketches of hidden rooms, planning how air could flow through underground tunnels, and calculating how much weight the earth above could bear. He mentioned a shed near the edge of his fields, one he would reinforce to conceal the true entrance. At this, Michael and Thomas looked at each other with wide eyes, for it seemed clear that the very shed they had opened was the same one Jonathan had written of. Turning further, they found not only descriptions but coded maps, symbols drawn in the margins, notes of hidden markers around the property. The initials CR appeared here too, though always without explanation. Sometimes Jonathan scribbled them in the corner of a page. Other times they appeared next to passages that spoke of secrecy and inheritance. The brothers puzzled over them, wondering if they referred to a partner, an architect, or perhaps even the man in the photographs they had found. The mystery deepened with each page. Amid the anxiety and planning, the diary also revealed glimpses of Jonathan's character. He was not merely a fearful man, but one deeply devoted to his family. He wrote tenderly of his wife, Elizabeth, and their two children, Henry and Clara. He described building swings from old rope for them, teaching them to plant seeds, and telling them stories by the fire. His desire to build the underground refuge was not born solely from paranoia, but from love. He could not bear the thought of his family suffering, so he poured his strength into creating what he called a sanctuary for tomorrow. Reading late into the night, the brothers found themselves drawn into the emotions of a man long dead. They felt the weight of his fears, the sincerity of his hopes, and the intensity of his determination. It was as if the diary had been waiting for them, carrying a voice that still spoke across the years. Michael, who had always been more reflective, felt a kinship with Jonathan's cautious nature, while Thomas admired the boldness of his vision, even if born from fear. Both agreed that the diary was not a relic to be discarded. It was a guide, a call to continue what had been left unfinished. As dawn crept through the window, pale and soft, they closed the diary, exhausted but electrified. Their minds swirled with the images Jonathan had painted, the secret rooms, the hidden tunnels, the supplies waiting in the earth. They imagined what might still lie buried beneath their land, untouched for generations. The blueprint, the initials, the careful notes all seemed to conspire toward one truth. Jonathan Grayson had built something extraordinary, and it was their task to find it. Over the following days, the brothers could think of little else. They returned again and again to the diary, cross-referencing the maps with the land they now walked. They marked spots where Jonathan had noted unusual trees or stones, looking for signs of disturbance. They paced the ground around the shed, pressing their ears to the soil in childish hope of hearing some hollow echo from below. Their boots traced new paths through the clearing, each step driven by the words of a man who had lived a century before them. At times they argued. Michael urged caution, reminding Thomas that the structure might be unstable, that digging without care could collapse whatever remained. Thomas scoffed at delays, hungry for discovery, unwilling to waste time while the mystery loomed so close. Yet even in disagreement, they shared the same restless urgency, bound together by the invisible thread of Jonathan's legacy. Every night they returned to their room with new ideas, new possibilities drawn from the diary's pages. They studied the blueprint, tracing the lines with their fingers, wondering what walls still stood below the soil and what had crumbled with time. They returned to the photographs, staring at the faces of Jonathan and his family, feeling both distant and strangely intimate with them. It was as if the land itself whispered to them now, urging them forward. One evening, as they pored over the diary once more, Michael noticed a passage they had overlooked. It described not only the refuge, but the philosophy behind it. Jonathan believed that wealth should never be squandered on luxury, but invested in survival and the future of the community. He spoke of leaving something for those who would come after him, a legacy not of fear, but of resilience. These words struck the brothers deeply, for they felt almost as if Jonathan had been writing directly to them. The mystery of the initial CR lingered, unsolved yet insistent. Jonathan's handwriting grew shaky in the later entries, his tone more desperate, yet the initials appeared more often, as though they carried the key to everything he had done. Michael speculated it might stand for Charles Radcliffe, a name faintly familiar from some story of local wealth, while Thomas dismissed it as coincidence. Still, the uncertainty only bound them more firmly to the quest. They had to know what lay beneath their feet. By the end of the week, the brothers had resolved themselves. They would not rest until they uncovered the refuge. The diary had given them a glimpse into a world half buried, a life's work sealed away by time. It was no longer just about curiosity or the thrill of discovery. It was about honoring the man whose voice still echoed in the fragile pages. They felt chosen, as though the land had waited for them specifically, as if the diary had been placed in their hands not by chance, but by destiny. With tools ready and determination hardened, they returned to the shed once more. The shadows of the late afternoon stretched long across the clearing, and the structure loomed darker than ever. But this time, they stepped toward it not as strangers stumbling upon a ruin, but as heirs answering a summons. The diary had opened the path, and now it was time to follow it into the earth itself. What lay hidden beneath their land, they could not yet know. But in their hearts, they understood that the answers awaited them underground, in the secret refuge that Jonathan Grayson had built for a tomorrow he would never see. And with that knowledge, their journey moved from pages of ink to the soil beneath their boots, toward discoveries that would test not only their courage, but their very bond as brothers. The diary had become their compass, each passage and sketch guiding their thoughts toward the soil that stretched beneath their boots. After nights of studying its fragile pages by lamplight and tracing the lines of the blueprint with their fingers, Michael and Thomas felt certain the shed was more than a relic. It was a doorway. Yet knowledge alone was not enough. If Jonathan Grayson had hidden a refuge beneath the ground, then years of earth and weather had conspired to bury it deeply, concealing its presence as though the land itself wished to guard the secret. The brothers knew that uncovering it would demand not just curiosity, but labor, patience, and resolve. The following morning they rose early, the air still cool and tinged with the smell of dew. Their truck rattled along the dirt road back to the clearing, loaded with supplies they had hastily gathered from the hardware store. Shovels, pickaxes, ropes, lanterns, and a bundle of boards to brace any hollow they might find. As they unloaded, the shed loomed in the soft light, its shadow stretched long across the grass. For the first time, it seemed less like a ruin and more like a guardian, silently watching their preparations. They began by pacing the ground around the shed, comparing the distances with the crude maps Jonathan had drawn in the margins of his diary. He had mentioned marker stones, trees, the angle of sunlight, but time had altered the landscape, erasing or disguising what he had once relied upon. Trees had fallen, new growth had sprung up, and stones had shifted. Each discrepancy forced them to guess, to argue, to return to the diary in search of some overlooked clue. The process was slow, and the sun climbed higher, pressing heat into their backs. Sweat darkened their shirts, and blisters formed on their hands, but neither spoke of stopping. The first day passed in fruitless digging. They worked in shifts, one breaking the soil while the other sifted through roots and rocks. They carved shallow pits in the ground, searching for any sign of hollow space, but each time the earth proved stubborn, yielding only worms and clay. By evening, their muscles ached, and frustration simmered between them. Thomas cursed the futility, his voice sharp, while Michael urged patience, reminding him that Jonathan had built with care and secrecy. If the refuge were easy to find, it would have been discovered long ago. Still, doubt gnawed at them both as they stared at the pitted earth, wondering if they were chasing shadows. That night, back in their room, they pored over the diary once again. Michael read passages aloud, his voice low, while Thomas leaned forward, his jaw tight, as though he could force meaning out of the faded ink by will alone. It was then that Michael noticed a subtle detail in the text they had overlooked before. Jonathan had written not of beneath the shed, but behind the shed, a difference small enough to escape notice, yet significant enough to shift their focus. Excitement flickered anew, banishing the fatigue of the day. They marked the page and resolved to begin fresh in the morning. The second day dawned clear and bright, and with renewed determination, they returned to the clearing. This time they turned their efforts to the ground just beyond the back wall of the shed, where a thicket of bushes clung stubbornly to the soil. They hacked away at the branches with machetes, the sharp tang of sap filling the air, until at last the wall of green gave way to bare earth. Beneath the roots, the ground felt uneven, subtly different from the rest. When Thomas stamped his boot down, the sound was muffled but faintly hollow, unlike the dense thud of solid soil. He froze, his eyes meeting Michael's, and for a moment neither moved, savoring the possibility that their search was nearing its end. With a surge of energy, they attacked the spot, shovels biting into the earth. The soil here was looser, darker, as though it had once been disturbed. Each thrust of the blade revealed more, and within an hour they struck against wood. Excitement spurred them on, their movements frantic now, clawing away dirt with bare hands when the shovels slowed them down. Gradually, the outline of a wooden surface emerged, its planks softened by age but still intact. It was a hatch, rectangular and sturdy despite the years. Moss clung to its edges and rusted iron hinges bound it to the earth. For a long moment the brothers knelt before it, catching their breath, staring as though at an artifact from another world. Here was proof that Jonathan's words had not been fantasy. His refuge was real, and its threshold lay before them. Caution returned as quickly as triumph. Michael pressed his palm against the hatch, feeling the cool dampness of the wood. He imagined what might lie below, caverns, unstable, airless chambers, or worse, nothing at all, just a collapsed void waiting to swallow them. Thomas, ever the bolder, wedged his shovel beneath the edge in pride. The wood resisted but groaned, a deep sound that seemed to echo from within the earth. With effort, they heaved the hatch open, and a rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of age and dust. Beneath the opening stretched a ladder descending into darkness. Its rungs were wooden, thick, and coated in grime. Yet when Thomas tested one with his weight, it held. They fetched their lanterns, lit the wicks, and watched as the glow spilled downward, revealing stone walls glistening with moisture. The passage seemed endless, disappearing into a pool of shadow. Fear and exhilaration warred within them as they stood at the edge. For years they had dreamed of escaping the monotony of their lives, of finding something greater than the soot-stained streets of their childhood. Now, at the lip of this hidden descent, they realized that dream had taken shape, not as farmland or orchards, but as a doorway into the unknown. Michael went first, his hands gripping the rungs, the lantern swinging from his belt, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Thomas followed close behind, his breath steady, but his heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the scent of damp stone. Each creak of the ladder reverberated in the silence, magnified until it seemed the whole world listened. At last their boots touched solid ground. The lanterns revealed a chamber carved from stone, its walls reinforced with timber beams blackened by age. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only by their footprints. The air was heavy but not suffocating, as though sealed for years yet preserved. In the dim light they saw shapes, shelves leaning under the weight of jars, stacks of wooden crates, and the faint outline of chairs arranged in a circle. For a long moment they stood in awe, speechless. The refugee Jonathan Grayson had written of was no longer words on a page. It was real, tangible, and vast, hidden beneath the very earth they had walked above without knowing. Their shovels and blisters, their arguments and doubts had led them here. The search was over, but the true discovery had only begun. As they raised their lanterns higher and stepped deeper into the chamber, they felt the eyes of the past upon them. The refuge was not merely a shelter, it was a message, a legacy left waiting in the dark, urging them onward to uncover what it meant and what it demanded of them. And with that, the next chapter of their journey opened before them, not in daylight but in the silent embrace of the underground. The lanterns swayed gently in their hands, casting uneven circles of light that chased the shadows clinging to the stone walls. Michael and Thomas stood in silence, their breathing slow and shallow as though the air itself might vanish if they drew too much. What stretched before them was not merely a crude cellar hastily dug for storage. It was something deliberate, a room carefully designed, strengthened by beams cut with precision, its stone walls sealed with mortar that had outlasted generations. The weight of time pressed down upon them, yet the structure held as if Jonathan Grayson's determination had turned the earth into a fortress. They moved forward cautiously, their boots stirring dust that danced in the glow. Wooden shelves lined one side of the chamber, bowed with the burden of glass jars whose contents had long since clouded with age. Some held dried grains turned to powder, others mysterious pickled remnants floating in liquid that had grown opaque. A thick film covered the surfaces, and when Thomas brushed his fingers across one jar, the grime came away in streaks, leaving the faint outline of a handprint that seemed eerily alive in the dimness. Against the far wall stood a table, its surface covered with stacks of books and scattered papers. The leather bindings were cracked, the pages curled, yet many remained intact. Michael leaned closer, recognizing titles in faded gilt letters, manuals on farming techniques, volumes of history, works of philosophy, even poetry. Jonathan had not only stocked food and tools, he had preserved knowledge, as if determined that the world within these walls should feed the mind as well as the body. There were chairs too, arranged in a semicircle facing the table, their wooden legs sinking into the dust. The scene carried an unsettling intimacy, as though a family had just risen and stepped away, leaving everything waiting for their return. The lantern light touched the outlines of their shapes, highlighting the hollow where someone might have rested their hand, the groove worn by years of use. The silence was so complete that the brothers could almost hear echoes of voices that once filled the room, laughter and whispers trapped in the stone. Then their eyes were drawn to the most striking feature of all. Hanging on the far wall, partly obscured by a heavy cloth, was a large canvas. The fabric sagged with age, but beneath it the shape of a painting could not be mistaken. Thomas stepped forward and tugged the cloth away, releasing a small storm of dust. The lanterns illuminated a portrait, its colors dimmed by decades but still vivid enough to capture the gaze. It was Jonathan Grayson, unmistakable from the photographs they had found. He stood tall in a dark suit, his eyes steady, his expression solemn but filled with pride. Beside him stood Elizabeth, her hand resting on the shoulders of Henry and Clara. The children stared forward with a mixture of innocence and gravity, as though they understood even in youth that their father's dream carried weight beyond their years. Behind them, painted in careful strokes, was the land itself, the fields, the trees, the sky stretching wide. And looming faintly in the background was the very shed that now stood decayed above. But it was not only the family that commanded attention. Behind them, painted on the wall of the portrait itself, was the symbol they had seen before, the upside-down triangle with the letters CR inscribed within. Here it was no scribble in a margin, no faded stamp on a blueprint, but a deliberate mark given permanence in paint. Its presence filled the brothers with a chill. Whatever CR represented, it had not been hidden in shame or secrecy, but displayed openly, tied to the very identity of the family. Michael's gaze shifted from the portrait to the wall itself, where the cloth had once hung. There, painted directly on the stone, was the same symbol, large and commanding, its lines sharp despite the passage of time. The initials stared at them, demanding recognition. Their mystery deepened rather than solved. It was then that Thomas noticed something at the base of the wall. Half buried in dust and fallen debris lay a small box, its surface darkened with age. He pulled it free and the lanterns revealed a simple wooden case bound with a delicate brass clasp. Inside lay a small iron key, its teeth sharp and ornate, alongside a folded letter sealed in wax that had long since cracked. Michael broke the brittle seal carefully, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. The letter was written in Jonathan's hand, though the strokes were weaker, more hurried than those in the diary. The words, though faded, were clear enough to read. To he who finds this place, know that you hold not only the weight of my family's work, but also its promise. The key will unlock what is yours. Guard it well, for it was meant to endure beyond me, beyond Elizabeth, beyond our children. Use it wisely and let it serve not only your blood, but all who walk this land after. The message struck them with a force that left them momentarily breathless. It was not addressed to a stranger, but to a descendant, a future bearer of the Grayson legacy. Michael felt a shiver run through him, for though they had not yet proven it, he could not shake the thought that their arrival here was no accident. Their connection to this land was deeper than mere ownership from an auction. It was as though the soil itself had called them home. With the key in hand, they searched the chamber for what it might fit. Their eyes swept over crates stacked in the corners, some bound with rusted chains, others sealed with nails. At last they found it, a chest unlike the others, larger, reinforced with iron bands and bearing a lock whose shape matched the teeth of the key. Dust coated its surface, but the carvings along its edges revealed intricate designs, patterns of vines, wheat stalks, and stars. It was both a container and a statement, crafted not for secrecy alone, but for significance. Michael held the key, his hesitation plain, while Thomas urged him forward. At last he bent to the lock, slid the iron teeth into place and turned. The mechanism groaned, reluctant at first, then gave way with a satisfying click. The brothers lifted the lid together, the hinges shrieking as though in protest. Inside, the lantern light glinted off piles of gold and silver coins, their surfaces dulled but unmistakably valuable. Nestled among them were small sacks that, when opened, spilled gems that flashed even in the dim glow. Alongside the treasure were documents sealed in wax, deeds that spoke of landholdings, shares, and wealth that had once belonged to the Grayson family. The brothers stared in silence, overwhelmed not merely by the material fortune, but by the enormity of the legacy that lay before them. For long minutes neither spoke. Thomas's mind raced with the possibilities, the debts they could erase, the life they could build, the freedom wealth could offer. Yet Michael's thoughts drifted to the diary, to Jonathan's words about survival, about using resources not for indulgence, but for a future that stretched beyond the self. The chest was not simply treasure, it was a question, a test of what they would do with what had been placed in their hands. The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of their differing instincts pressing against their bond. In the flickering lantern light, with the treasure glinting and the portrait of Jonathan and his family watching from the wall, the brothers felt the gravity of choice settle upon them. Their journey had begun with curiosity, had led them through toil and doubt, and now stood poised to define not only their future, but perhaps the very spirit of the land itself. The underground chamber, with its books, its jars, its painting, and its chest of wealth, had become more than a refuge. It was a mirror reflecting both the past and the present, demanding that those who found it decide what kind of future would follow. And as Michael and Thomas closed the chest once more, lanterns dimming, they knew that the true challenge was not in discovering the legacy, but in determining how to carry it forward. They ascended the ladder slowly, each step heavier than the last, the key and letter tucked safely in Michael's pocket. Above, the air of the clearing felt sharper, brighter, as though the earth itself exhaled in relief at their emergence. Yet neither brother spoke as they stood beneath the open sky. The discovery had been made, but the decision of what to do with it lingered unspoken between them, a question that would follow them into the days to come. When the hatch closed above them, and the earth swallowed once more the secrets of the underground chamber, the brothers stood together in the fading light of evening, the chest of treasure and the weight of choice pressing heavily upon their minds. The coins, the deeds, the gems, they glittered in memory even when hidden from view. their promise echoing with every heartbeat. Yet alongside that promise came the gaze of Jonathan Grayson's portrait, the stern and enduring eyes that seemed to linger on them even in the open air. It was not simply wealth they had uncovered, but an inheritance wrapped in expectation, a silent demand that they determine how it would be used. For days they spoke little of what they had found. Each morning they returned to the land, pacing its boundaries, their boots crushing the grass as if tracing invisible lines between past and future. Thomas's thoughts bent instinctively toward what the treasure could provide: the escape from hardship, the building of a grand house, the chance to live comfortably at last. He imagined new trucks, modern equipment, the kind of prosperity that could erase the long years of labor in the soot-stained town they had left behind. But Michael's mind lingered on Jonathan's words, the diary's passages written in a trembling hand that spoke of responsibility, of survival, of leaving something not only for one's own children, but for those yet unborn. The tension between them deepened, silent at first, then voiced in long debates that stretched into the night. Thomas argued that the treasure belonged to them, that fate had delivered it into their hands, and that it would be foolish to squander their fortune on others who had done nothing to earn it. Michael countered with quiet conviction, reminding him that Jonathan had built not for selfish gain, but for protection, that he had preserved books as carefully as food because he had believed in the endurance of knowledge, in community, in resilience. To use the treasure only for themselves would be to betray the very spirit of the refuge they had uncovered. It was not an easy argument to win, for desire is a powerful force, and Thomas's hunger for change burned brightly. Yet over time, as they returned again and again to the chamber, standing beneath the painted eyes of Jonathan and Elizabeth and the children who had long since turned to dust, Thomas began to feel the same weight his brother carried. He read the letter once more, the words urging the finder to use the key wisely, not selfishly, and though his pride resisted, his heart began to bend. The decision came slowly, shaped not in a single moment of revelation, but through countless small recognitions. They walked through the fields and imagined them restored, not as private estates, but as gardens and orchards that could feed many. They stood by the sagging shed and saw not a ruin, but the foundation of something new. A hall that could echo with the sound of voices learning, working, building. They returned to the town and met the eyes of children who played barefoot in alleys, their futures clouded by poverty, and they felt the pull of responsibility. The treasure was theirs, yes, but in truth it had never been meant only for them. With resolve forged between them, the brothers set to work. The land that had lain forgotten for decades awoke beneath their hands. They cleared the brush, tore down the rotting fences, and plowed the soil that had hardened under neglect. With part of the treasure, they purchased seeds and tools, restoring the fields to life. The shed they dismantled plank by plank, salvaging what could be saved, then rebuilt it as a sturdy wooden hall with wide doors and windows that caught the sunlight. Its purpose was not secrecy, but openness, a place where neighbors could gather, where children could learn, where the spirit of Jonathan's refuge could live above the ground as well as beneath it. As weeks turned into months, word spread. Families from the town came to see the transformation, at first curious, then eager to join. Men who had lost their jobs found work in the fields, their hands turning the soil rich again. Women taught the younger ones skills of weaving, cooking, and care. And children, once left to idle in the dusty streets, filled the hall with their laughter, sitting at long tables where books, some rescued from the underground chamber, others newly purchased, were laid out for them to read. It became not merely a farm, but a school of life, a place where knowledge and labor intertwined. Michael and Thomas labored beside them all, their shoulders aching, but their hearts light. Each day as they worked, they remembered Jonathan's vision, and each evening they descended into the chamber to ensure its preservation, careful not to let its treasures be forgotten, even as they used its wealth to build above. The chest of coins grew lighter as they invested its contents into lumber, tools, and wages, but they felt no loss. Instead, they felt the growing weight of something intangible, something greater: respect, gratitude, purpose. The underground refuge became a place of reverence. They cleaned its walls, repaired its beams, and left the portrait in its rightful place. Visitors were brought down carefully, shown the shelves of books, the jars, the circle of chairs. They listened to the story of Jonathan Grayson, a man who had feared the collapse of the world, but who, in preparing for it, had created a legacy that endured long after him. The symbol of the triangle and initial CR remained unsolved in its precise meaning, but it no longer mattered as much. To the community, it came to represent resilience, continuity, and the bond between generations. Years passed, and the land flourished. Fields of golden wheat waved beneath the wind, orchards blossomed in spring, and children ran barefoot through grass that had once grown wild with neglect. The hall, once a shed of rot, now rang with the voices of teachers and students, of neighbors gathered to celebrate harvests, of songs carried late into the night. Michael and Thomas watched it all with quiet pride, knowing that their choice had turned treasure into something far greater than wealth. It had turned it into life. Though they often thought of what might have been the comfort they could have bought, the ease they could have lived in, they never regretted the path they chose. For when they looked into the eyes of the children who studied by lamplight, when they watched families share food grown in the soil they had reclaimed, they felt the truth of Jonathan's vision alive before them. They had not simply inherited land or gold. They had inherited a duty, and by fulfilling it, they had discovered a peace far deeper than riches could provide. On one autumn evening, as the sun set low and painted the fields in fire, the brothers stood side by side at the edge of the property. The air carried the scent of harvest, and the laughter of children drifted from the hall. Michael turned to Thomas and saw in his brother's face the same reflection of peace that filled his own. They had found treasure, yes, but more importantly, they had found meaning. The land that had once been silent and forsaken now thrummed with life, and in its renewal, they too had been remade. The portrait of Jonathan still watched from beneath the earth, his painted eyes unblinking, his legacy secured. The CR symbol still marked the stone, its riddle unsolved. But perhaps that was as it should be. For some mysteries are less about answers than about guidance, leading those who come after toward choices that matter. Michael and Thomas no longer sought to unravel it. They were content to live in the story it had woven around them. And so the land once abandoned became a place of hope, of labor, of knowledge. The brothers who had come seeking ownership found instead stewardship, and in that stewardship they discovered themselves. The true inheritance was not the gold, nor the deeds, nor even the refuge hidden beneath the soil. The true inheritance was the life they built, the community they nurtured, and the future they secured for others. In this, Jonathan's vision endured, and in this, the brothers found their peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next shocking discovery. Tap the bell so you're the first to see what we uncover in our upcoming videos. And if this story kept you hooked, check out the next video on your screen right now. It's even more unbelievable. Share this video with your friends and family because trust me, they won't believe what happens next.